Hi everyone. This week I had chapter 6 in the Johnson book, and it's in the Radical Behaviorism book. And it starts off with a scenario about Bridget and Alan. And Bridget is the BCBA on the case, and she's been working with Alan for 2 years, who was diagnosed with autism when he was 3. The book says that he was a mess when she first met him, and it goes through how she took all of her training and she put it to work, and he's now at a place where he is able to carry on meaningful conversations on his own. Bridget then looks at that it's time to take his ability to the next level, and build on observations and problem solving on his own, and to focus on reasoning in more advanced ways, and reasoning with himself and then others. The chapter then jumps into what is reasoning, and it has the question that is it more than just verbal behavior? When we think things through or consider the evidence, we call that reasoning instantly. We don't question it. That's our reason behind it. That's our reasoning. That's why we did it. It's what we believe. We have given the characteristics of considering the evidence the label reasoning, but this is just a word. It really has no meaning. It's just what we've called it, and a verbal response to something. And because it is just a word, it doesn't mean that reasoning has any distinct physical. It's not a thing. The chapter then goes into what the propositions are. Verbal behavior is generally called reasoning, and that might be different from other forms of verbal behavior, but it does involve the same verbal response classes that Skinner talks about in his verbal behavior book that we're also reading. A proposition is what we know, believe, think, judge, or assume. So it's things that we take from our own personal lives and put into something we're either talking about or explaining to another person. And when I see the word proposition, I think you're trying to make a deal with somebody. You create this plan and you present it to somebody. In the book, it actually gives the example of a judge in front of a jury, and they have to give a proposition, and they try to influence them. So every time I saw this word, I thought it's something that I believe that I want that another person to believe, or something that I think or I assume that I want to convince, or have someone think the same way I do. An example of a proposition that was in the book, it says that the sky is blue. It's something that we believe, or it's right there. We can point out it's blue. We all see it. We're offering a proposition if we say that the sky is blue. That's our proposition. When we make those statements about something that we know, we're admitting the verbal behavior that Skinner calls tacks. And tacks are verbal responses that are consistently reinforced in the presence of a particular event or object. So it's something that we do that we get feedback immediately, and it's consistent and it's always there. The example again says if we say the word car and the response is consistently reinforced in the presence of cars, then the car is the sole source of the control over the response, and that's known as a pure tact. So if I say tree and I'm in a forest, and the tree is my control, that's my pure tact. Tacts can relate to verbal behavior and to nonverbal features in the environment, although much of our environment does consist of verbal behaviors of others. So it all plays off of each other. And this is called intraverbal. So intra is, it's all related somehow. So they play off of each other. We know that propositions involve the speaker's behavior, and it is important for us to consider the consequences, not only of us, if we're the ones giving the proposition, we're the speaker, but to the person we're talking to, who we label the listener. The speaker's behavior, when they're admitting a proposition, is likely to be reinforced. It's a positive reinforcement, usually, when the listener accepts or believes it. So that's our reinforcement. If I say something and they believe me, I'm going to have that reinforcement or that feedback that's positive. The proposition, they believed it, they accepted it. And then the listener's behavior, with the reinforcement to the proposition, reference to the proposition, may also be effective or ineffective regardless of the truth of the proposition. So if I'm making something up, and the listener knows that it's made up, it's an ineffective proposition. But if I told the truth and they believe me, it has an effective experience on the listener, and what their reinforcement is different as well. The chapter then goes on to verbal behavior in the form of a proposition, and this can be defined as effective in two ways. If the listener acts on the proposition as a verbal stimulus, and if acting upon the proposition produces reinforcing outcomes for the listener. So if the listener has a proposition given to them and they act on it, it's a verbal stimulus. And then if acting upon that proposition produces reinforcing outcome for the listener, it's also effective. So those are the two ways. The outcome of the listeners when they accept the proposition that has been said is reinforced. We, as the speaker, start to emit more propositions that increase the likelihood of that result. We want them to believe us. We want them to accept our proposition. So that means we're going to do more and more things. We're going to say more things that we know we're going to get that instant, consistent result that they're going to believe us and accept what we're saying. And that means we want our listener to be more likely to agree with what we're saying. We try to find other things that they'll also support that could be connected in some way. We reason with others when we emit verbal behavior that changes the likelihood of the listener accepting certain propositions, which is, we also learn to reason with ourselves that way. So we say things to the listener and they accept it, and then we may realize that they only accept things when we say it a certain way. When we reason with ourselves, we do that. We reason with ourselves in a way we know that we'll accept it. We're not the people who are going to sit and fight with our own subconscious. So we reason with ourselves in a way we know we can't disagree with. They're not very particular about the criteria about labeling verbal behavior as reasoning. Sometimes something may happen, and without really thinking, we conclude something. So an example in the book was, you hear a noise in the kitchen, but you instantly just know that it's your roommate. And then it drops down and it said, because we watched them walk to the kitchen, we know where they are. So you don't really think twice about something when you already learn, you have experience. That's building on like the schema that we have. We already know something. So if it's like X, Y, like ABC, A, then B, then C, we know the order of things. We kind of can conclude without really reasoning with ourselves. The chapter also discusses deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning, and I know I've heard the words before, but in a reasoning state, it's kind of different, but it was interesting to read about it. For deductive reasoning, if a listener accepts any two simple propositions separately, then they're more likely to accept a conjunctive proposition, which means if we're saying, like, if we say one simple one and they accept it, and then we come back and we have a second simple one, they accept that one. If we decide to put them together with like and, then, something with those words, they're more likely to take it as a whole and just accept it for what it is. We reason deductively when we emit propositions in a way that corresponds to the rules of logic and reasoning. May be considered deductive in form if it can be described by those rules. So if we can get them to agree to everything we've said. Inductive reasoning, on the other hand, is when there are patterns of verbal behavior and when there's an absence of such formal rules. So it goes back to how a person can accept, for deductive reasoning, accept one simple proposition and then a second one. Inductive reasoning is if they disagree with one, we can't combine them. I also noted that if a particular event occurs when another event occurs, and then it never when it doesn't, it could be reasoned that the two events are causally related. So I had reread that a couple of times. So if one thing happens and then another thing happens at the same time, then we can kind of just be like, okay, they're related. Like, this happened then. So like an if-then statement. And then it just keeps going like, this happened and then that happened. But if one thing happens and then the second event never occurs, we can say that they're just kind of casually related. Like sometimes they might. So going through the chapter, the question that I came up with, I kept going back to the beginning scenario with Bridget. But I didn't want to pose the question of what your exact plan would be. So I looked at it as looking at how reasoning is based on things that we know or assume. How would you teach someone the rules of reasoning or break it down in a way that anyone can really understand? We kind of have a general idea of what we're doing. We've read all these books, so we can break it down now and kind of understand. But how would you break it down? So